Harrison Ford, you reveal in your book, after 40 years, is that right?
40 years I thought I'd wait.
Okay, so you revealed that you were having an affair with Harrison Ford.
I was.
Well, you say it.
He has flown the Millennium Falcon, cracked the whip as Indiana Jones, and spent 5 decades being one of the most bankable faces in film history. But the part of his life that took the longest to come into focus was never the one on screen. It was the home he built before anyone knew his name, the marriage that quietly fell apart while the whole world was watching Star Wars conquer movie theaters, and the decades he spent saying almost nothing about it. At 83 years old, Harrison Ford has lived long enough to watch the story get told for him, by other people, in other people's words, and what's left now is simply the timeline itself, laid out plainly, without the spin. So let's go back to where it actually started, long before anyone called him a star. In the early 1960s, Harrison Ford was not auditioning for blockbusters. He was working with his hands. Long before Han Solo or Indiana Jones meant anything to anyone, Ford supported himself as a self-taught carpenter in Los Angeles, building cabinets and taking on construction jobs while picking up small, forgettable parts in television and film. Acting, at that point, was closer to a side hustle than a career. He had signed with Columbia Pictures in the early 60s, but the studio let him go after his roles failed to gain any traction, and carpentry became the steadier and more reliable way to pay the bills. It was during this uncertain, unglamorous stretch of his life that he met Mary Marquardt. They married in 1964, years before fame was even a realistic possibility, which meant their relationship was built on something far more ordinary than red carpets, shared financial pressure, a shared home, and the day-to-day grind of figuring out adulthood together. Their first son, Benjamin, arrived in 1966, and their second son, Willard, followed in 1969. By the end of that decade, Ford's life had settled into a pattern that looked nothing like the one history would eventually remember him for. He was, in no particular order, a father, a tradesman, and an actor who hadn't yet had his breakthrough. That breakthrough came almost by accident. Ford's carpentry work put him in contact with several industry figures, including a young director named George Lucas, for whom Ford had done renovation work. That connection eventually led to a small role in Lucas's 1973 film American Graffiti, a film that gave Ford a small amount of visibility but nothing close to stardom. Still, it kept him in Lucas's orbit, and when Lucas began assembling the cast for an ambitious, expensive, and at the time deeply uncertain science fiction project, Ford was nearby. He wasn't even technically auditioning when he first read for what would become Star Wars. He had been brought in to help other actors run their lines during casting sessions. But something about the way he delivered those lines, dry, grounded, a little sarcastic, caught Lucas's attention, and the role of Han Solo slowly reshaped itself around him. It's easy to forget now, given how massive the Star Wars franchise eventually became, just how shaky its production really was. Filming took place across Elstree Studios in England and the punishing desert locations of Tunisia, and the shoot was defined by rewritten scripts, technical malfunctions, and a budget that made studio executives nervous. Nobody on that set, including Ford himself, had any real sense that they were building one of the most influential franchises in movie history. When filming wrapped in 1976, Ford went home to an ordinary life. He was still married to Mary Marquardt. They were still raising 2 young sons in Los Angeles. Star Wars was just one more credit in a career that hadn't broken through yet, and there was no guarantee the film would even be a hit, let alone reshape the rest of his life. Then, in May of 1977, Star Wars opened in American theaters, and everything shifted almost overnight. What began as a limited release exploded into a cultural phenomenon within weeks, with lines wrapping around city blocks in places like New York and Los Angeles. Ford hadn't been positioned as the film's lead, but audiences gravitated toward Han Solo immediately, drawn to the character's wit, his moral ambiguity, and the sense that he didn't quite belong in the same heroic mold as the rest of the cast. As the film's box office climbed past hundreds of millions of dollars worldwide, Ford's personal life underwent a transformation that happened far too quickly for anyone to adjust to gracefully. He went from being a working actor who still picked up carpentry jobs on the side to being one of the most recognizable faces on the planet, in the span of just a few months. And while his career accelerated at a pace nobody could have predicted, his marriage to Mary Marquardt began to strain under a kind of pressure it was never built to withstand. It's within this exact window, the chaos of Star Wars production in 1976, that one of the most talked about chapters of Ford's personal history took root. At the time, Ford was 33 years old and married to Marquardt. Carrie Fisher, cast as Princess Leia, was only 19. The two crossed paths during the long, isolating stretch of filming in England and Tunisia, and a brief relationship developed between them, one that stayed almost entirely private for nearly 4 decades. Fisher didn't speak publicly about it until 2016, when she published her memoir, The Princess Diarist, drawing on diary entries she had written during the original Star Wars shoot. In the book, she described becoming infatuated with Ford during filming, framing it through the lens of being a teenager suddenly thrust into intense fame, long working hours, and emotional isolation on a chaotic, high-pressure set far from home. According to coverage of the memoir, the relationship lasted roughly as long as the production itself, around 3 months, and ended naturally once filming concluded and the cast scattered back into their separate lives. What made Fisher's account so significant wasn't necessarily the relationship itself, but the fact that it had remained essentially unconfirmed rumor for nearly 40 years before she chose to write about it in her own words. She didn't frame it as some sweeping, lifelong romance. Instead, she described it as a short, emotionally intense experience that left a lasting impression precisely because of how young and unprepared she was when it happened. In interviews promoting the book, Fisher reflected on the distance between how she felt at 19 and how she understood that period decades later, treating the material less as gossip and more as an honest reckoning with memory and the strange permanence of certain emotional experiences. She also revealed that she had told Ford ahead of time that she planned to write about that period of her life, a decision she later admitted was complicated in hindsight, and she described his reaction as cautious, reportedly mentioning a lawyer, which she interpreted less as a denial and more as concern over how the story would be controlled once it became public. Ford's own response, once the book came out, was notably brief. In interviews following the memoir's release, including conversations reported by outlets like Rolling Stone and GQ, he didn't dispute Fisher's account, but he also didn't elaborate on it. Asked about the book directly, his most quoted reaction was that the whole thing felt strange, and when asked whether he had actually read the memoir, he said simply that he hadn't. Beyond that, he declined to go further, a pattern that continued even after Fisher's unexpected death in December of 2016, after which he chose to keep his public comments focused on remembering her as brilliant and fearless rather than revisiting the specifics of their history together. It's worth being clear about something here. Ford has never publicly framed that brief relationship with Fisher as the reason his marriage to Marquardt ended. What the timeline actually shows is overlap, not a clean cause and effect. Between 1976 and 1979, Ford's life was being reshaped on multiple fronts at once. He was becoming globally famous. He was being flooded with new professional opportunities and demands he'd never had to manage before. And at the same time, his marriage, the one built quietly in the years before any of this fame existed, was unraveling under the weight of all that sudden change. The relationship with Fisher, when it became public decades later, got attached retroactively to a period that was already defined by upheaval, but the marriage's end was ultimately the result of a much broader transformation in Ford's life, not a single isolated episode. After Star Wars, Ford and Fisher's lives moved in very different directions. Fisher went on to write candidly about relationships, mental health, and addiction in her later work, building a public voice that was almost the opposite of Ford's tendency toward privacy. She had a notable relationship and brief marriage to musician Paul Simon in the early 1980s, and in 1992 she had a daughter, Billie Lowatt, after which much of her public identity shifted toward motherhood and writing rather than romantic narrative. When she passed away in December 2016, Ford's tribute to her was short and restrained, a final, quiet echo of how he had handled the entire subject from the beginning. For Ford, the collapse of his first marriage marked the close of one chapter, but it also opened the door to a new one. After the seismic success of Star Wars, Hollywood treated him less like an unproven actor and more like a guaranteed box office draw, and in 1981 that status solidified completely with the release of Raiders of the Lost Ark, directed by Steven Spielberg and produced by George Lucas. Filmed across locations in Tunisia, England, and Hawaii on a budget of roughly $20 million, the film introduced Indiana Jones, a character that blended physical adventure with an intellectual, archaeological backstory in a way audiences had never quite seen packaged together before. The film became the highest-grossing release of 1981 in the United States and earned 9 Academy Award nominations, winning 5, cementing Ford as a star capable of carrying not one but 2 major franchises at the same time. He did much of his own stunt work during filming, and the physical toll only added to the sense that his stardom had been earned rather than handed to him. It was during this period of peak fame that Ford found love again. In 1983, he married screenwriter Melissa Matheson, who had recently written E.T. the Extraterrestrial, a film that went on to gross hundreds of millions of dollars worldwide and become one of the defining movies of its era. Their marriage brought together 2 people at the height of their respective fields, his as an actor commanding global recognition, hers as a screenwriter behind one of the most beloved films of the decade. Together they built a family, welcoming a son, Malcolm, in 1987, and a daughter, Georgia, in 1990. During these years, Ford's career kept expanding with films like Blade Runner, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, and Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, each one requiring long stretches away from home, filming across continents and pulling him further from the day-to-day rhythm of family life. By the 1990s, Ford had become one of the highest-paid actors in the industry, and projects like The Fugitive, which grossed well over $300 million worldwide and earned 7 Academy Award nominations, only reinforced his standing as one of Hollywood's most reliable leading men. But professional success and personal stability don't always move in the same direction. Unlike his first marriage, the end of his relationship with Matheson wasn't marked by scandal or any single defining public rupture. Matheson continued to work selectively as a screenwriter while keeping a relatively low public profile, focused largely on her family. The couple separated in 2000, closing out a 17-year marriage that had spanned the entire arc of Ford's transformation from rising star to global icon, and their divorce was finalized in 2004, handled with the same privacy that had defined the relationship throughout. The emotional weight of that chapter became more visible years later, after Matheson passed away in 2015 from cancer at the age of 65. Ford never turned that loss into a public spectacle, but the timeline itself spoke to how significant that period of his life had been, a long family chapter that had developed in parallel with his rise to global stardom. Life, as it tends to do, kept moving. In 2002, at the Golden Globe Awards in Los Angeles, Ford met actress Calista Flockhart for the first time. By then, he was a two-franchise legend with decades of fame behind him, while Flockhart was at the peak of her own television success, known across the country for her role in Ally McBeal, one of the defining shows of the late 1990s. What made this relationship different from Ford's earlier ones wasn't how quickly it developed, but how slowly and deliberately it did. His first marriage had begun long before fame arrived. His second had developed right in the middle of his most explosive professional years. This one unfolded once his career had largely stabilized, when he was operating less as a rapidly rising star and more as an established figure choosing his projects selectively rather than chasing every opportunity. Ford and Flockhart's relationship grew gradually over several years, with public appearances that were noticeably less frequent than what's typical for a couple of their fame. During this time, Ford continued working on projects like K-19, The Widowmaker and, eventually, Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, while Flockhart transitioned away from her Ally McBeal years into a quieter phase of her own career. Their professional paths weren't perfectly aligned, but the relationship had enough stability to avoid the kind of overlapping production pressures that had strained both of Ford's earlier marriages. By 2009, things had reached a point of formal commitment, and Ford proposed. In June 2010, the two married in Santa Fe, New Mexico, a deliberate departure from the typical Hollywood backdrop. Santa Fe wasn't a media hub like Los Angeles or New York, it was quieter, more private, and that choice reflected something that had become increasingly clear about Ford's later life, a preference for controlled exposure over public spectacle. One of the more meaningful developments during this period was Ford's relationship with Flockhart's son, Liam, whom he formally adopted after their marriage. It wasn't treated as a major public statement, but it represented something genuinely new in Ford's life, his first transition into a blended family role outside of the children from his previous marriages. That kind of integration stood in sharp contrast to the geographic distance and long absences that had defined his earlier family life, shaped as it was by the relentless production schedules of two major franchises. Unlike his earlier relationships, this one carried no publicly documented breakdown, no scandal, no high-profile conflict for the tabloids to chase. Public appearances stayed occasional. Interviews about their relationship remained minimal. And in an industry where visibility often defines a relationship's narrative, this one was defined instead by its consistent, deliberate quiet. Throughout this later chapter of his life, Ford's career also shifted into something closer to selective continuation rather than constant expansion. He returned to familiar roles when it made sense to, including a reprisal of Han Solo in Star Wars, The Force Awakens, reconnecting with the very franchise that had upended his life decades earlier. But even as those returns brought him back into the public eye, his personal life with Flockhart remained steady, largely unaffected by the renewed attention. That stability became especially noticeable whenever older chapters of his life resurfaced in the media, which is exactly what happened after Carrie Fisher's memoir brought their decades-old relationship back into public conversation. Even then, Ford's responses stayed brief and restrained, consistent with the way he had always handled that subject. He didn't reinterpret it for a new audience or offer fresh emotional commentary. In interviews like the one with GQ, later covered by Rolling Stone, his description of the situation as simply strange, paired with his refusal to elaborate, reflected a consistency in his character rather than any sudden shift toward openness. Looking back across all of it, the carpentry jobs before fame, the marriage to Mary Marquardt built in financial uncertainty, the chaotic Tunisia shoot that turned him into Han Solo overnight, the brief and quietly devastating relationship with a 19-year-old Carrie Fisher, the slow unraveling of his first marriage as his career exploded beyond anyone's control, the second marriage to Melissa Matheson that thrived during his most legendary years before eventually fading, and finally the steady, deliberately private life he built with Calista Flockhart. What emerges isn't really a single confession or one dramatic revelation. It's a pattern. Harrison Ford has spent more than 5 decades choosing, again and again, to let the work speak loudly while keeping the rest of his life as quiet as possible. Even when other people, like Carrie Fisher, chose to speak openly about shared history, Ford's instinct was never to match that openness with his own. He offered just enough to acknowledge the truth of what happened without ever turning it into spectacle.